Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Imagine what it would be like to retire early. If you're under the age of 65 and listening to this podcast, retiring early is probably one of your dreams. There's a big insurance company that advertises Freedom 55, where they show you how to retire at the age of 55. My guest today is a guy who retired at the age of 48, so he was way earlier than age 55. Now, maybe when you hear that, you say to yourself, well, okay, there were probably some exceptional circumstances. He was probably one of those dot-com millionaires, or he was the CEO of some big company. Nope. My guest today didn't go to college. He worked in a factory on the line and then moved into an office job at the factory, so he made okay money, but was never one of the highest paid employees. Now you might think, okay, he retired at age 48 and then he ran out of money and had to go back to work. Nope. In fact, today he is 80 years old and still comfortably retired, so he's actually been retired for more years than he worked at his main job. So how did he do it? What's his secret to having a regular job and still being able to retire almost 2 decades earlier than the average Canadian worker? That's our topic today here on Debt Free in 30. What can you do to retire early? Feel free to take notes, but we'll have a full transcript of this podcast up on our Hoyes.com website, and at the end I'll summarize the top 5 tips for retiring early. So, let's get started. Who are you?
Bob Lassaline.
And you retired at age 48, is that correct?
Right on, just a little bit before my 48 even.
How old are you today?
80 years old.
80 years old. And the reason that I know you, and we're recording this today, is I've known you for, 20-some years. I married your daughter 21 years ago, so it's been longer than that. This is my father-in-law, Bob Lassaline, who retired at age 48. And I'd like to go through the scenario of how you did that, because if I do my math correctly, you've been retired longer than you worked.
That's true.
Is that true?
Yep.
So you started working in what year?
1954 at Chrysler's. I worked the year before that at Underwood Typewriter.
So Chrysler's was where you were for your entire working career, other than, as you said, a brief job before that. So you retired 30 years later. That would have been 1984. When did you first start thinking about retiring early? I assume it wasn't the day you started working in 1954. When was it?
That is something that came into the union at the automobile industry. Came up with a 30-year and out plan, and that kind of popped into my mind based on what I started my life and involved with my finances and the way I acted my life. And it just kicked in that time to start planning for my 30 years, even though it was quite a ways away.
So let's talk about that, starting to plan for the retirement. And the people who are listening today, well, maybe they're not retiring at, this age or that age, but at some future date, we all want to retire. And, one of my goals was to retire before I hit age 48, so I could beat you, but I'm 52 years old today, so obviously I didn't make it. I've been working longer. So walk me through the thought process then. What was your strategy to retire in effect early? What kind of things were you doing, 10, 20 years before retirement?
Well, I think it started off with my whole way of hanging on to a penny or a dollar at that time. I started working on my dad's farm. He paid me $2 a day to hoe weeds in the summertime and while I was going to school. And I just put that money away. Fortunately, my dad didn't charge me interest, so whatever money I made from his farm, I just hung on to it as a package, knowing that I'd like to have a car someday, and I'd like to have a good job someplace because my father encouraged me not to stay working as a farmer.
Tell me about saving then. So once you had started working at Chrysler's, what was your savings approach? What was your process? Did you have some target? I want to save this amount of money. How did you do it?
Well, I think the target that you're talking about started with my first car. I wanted to own a car of my own. I bought a used Studebaker, and I bought that in 1953, and I paid $850 cash for it. And that was coming from the $2 a day that my father gave me.
And so that was even before you started working at Chrysler's. That was a year before.
Right, yep.
And so the first purchase you wanted to make was that car. Was that the first car you ever bought, or did you have a car
First
before
used car, no, that was it.
First car you ever bought, a used Studebaker. And what year was the car?
1947.
So it was obviously a few years old at that point, and so you knew it was going to cost $800.
Yep.
And you didn't go out and get a car loan to do it. That's how everyone does it today. You didn't lease it. That's the other way everyone does it today. Did they have such things as car leases back in the 50s?
No. You'd either paid for it in installments, say maybe buy the car today and 6 months pay the balance. But I had enough to pay for the thing right outright.
So you were able to walk in. Did you buy it at the dealership? Did you buy it from someone?
I bought it from the Studebaker dealership, right?
And so you paid $800 for it. And
$850.
$850, and that's money you had saved yourself. You had the cash for it. So why did you buy a used car and not a new car?
Because I didn't have any more than $850. And the money wasn't in the bank. It was at home in my drawer.
So you didn't even have it in the bank?
No.
And why was that?
Well, because I knew what I was looking for was a car, and I didn't need a bank to help me with it. I knew I would be able to pay for it when I needed it.
Now, you're retired today. Do you actually have money in the bank now, or is it all in a drawer somewhere?
No, I'd like to keep it in the drawer, but unfortunately it's in a bank.
It's in a bank. So, okay, so today your money's in a bank. Now, tell me about your first house then. You know, when you got married, you were renting a place?
We rented from an uncle of mine, right.
So you rented a place, and then at what point did you buy your first house?
We rented there for about a year.
And then you bought your first house?
I bought a house, a used house. I made an offer I had $10,000 in the bank. By that time, I put the money in the bank. I had $10,000 in the bank, cash. And this house came up for sale, so instead of renting, we decided to buy the house. Offered $10,000, but they rejected it. And my wife was a bit upset because I wouldn't go up any. I said, I got $10,000 and I'm going to use the $10,000. So about 3 weeks later, they called back and offered me to buy the house for the $10,000.
Kind of called their bluff. Now, how in the world were you able to save up $10,000? Because even today, $10,000 is a lot of money, and obviously we're talking about the 50s. Is the late 50s, I guess, is what we're talking about when you bought that house. So in today's terms, that's got to be, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. I don't even know how much it is. It's a lot more. So how were you able to save that kind of money?
Well, because when I started my job at Chrysler's, I realized that it was a pretty well-paying job, and I knew I didn't need that much money. So I was able to put some away. And I came up with a theory that I think it was old at the time, but my theory was a part of all you earn is yours to keep, which in my mind meant 10%. So I put a plan down that everything that I saved, I would put 10% of it for mine to keep. And that doesn't mean go and buy a car or a truck or a bicycle. It meant that I'm going to keep that money. So I started with that principle before I got to the point where I moved into this new house.
And how did that actually work? So when you were working at Chrysler's back in the 50s, how often did you get paid?
Once a month when I was in the office. I moved from the factory to the office once a month.
So once a month, that makes budgeting probably more difficult than if you got paid every week, I would think, because that paycheck has to last for the whole month. How did you actually save the money then? So did you actually got a physical check back in those days? It probably wasn't direct deposit, I'm guessing. So what did you do? You took your check to the bank, and explain to me how you actually saved the money.
Yes, the bank was right across the road from the office at the Chrysler plant that I worked in, and I opened a bank account there.
So you'd go on payday, you take your check to the bank.
Right.
You deposit it in your bank account. And then how did you save the 10%? Did you have a separate bank account?
I had a separate bank account for the 10%, right.
So you had your normal checking account, a savings account. So the first thing you did with the paycheck was put 10% into the savings account.
Right.
And then you lived off the other 90%, obviously. You had, your groceries and all your other living costs. Back in those days, do you have any recollection of what a paycheck was?
It was $1.35 an hour at Chrysler's when you got your seniority.
$1.30, and that wasn't a junior person. That was you'd been there for
when I had
period
seniority. Yeah.
So, and it was typically a 40-hour week.
Right.
So you were making whatever that is, $45 a week or something like that. So less than a couple of $100 a month is what you'd be able to earn there.
Right.
So you put the money into the savings account. Did you earn interest on it then in the savings account?
No, that was one little mistake I made. I just kept it in the regular account and it wasn't paying any interest. I wasn't giving that a thought at that particular time. But then I had a friend that started to work with me that worked in a bank. And he told me about these things called GICs, that you could invest in it and get an interest rate instead of just leaving it in the bank and looking at it and counting it and watching it. But he told me that I could go back to this bank and they would take my money and they would give me interest for a period of time.
So one of your first mistakes was not realizing that you can actually earn interest on your savings.
In the beginning, I didn't.
In the beginning.
No, yeah.
So you bought the house. So your first house you paid $10,000 for.
Well, yeah, it had a mortgage on it, but when I made a deal to buy it, I was going to pay cash. I told him I wanted to pay $10,000. I'd pay him $10,000 cash for that first house that we bought.
And you lived in that house for roughly how long? A couple of years, 3 years?
Yeah, I think probably 5. But I didn't pay cash for the house, by the way, because my real estate agent told me I didn't have to. He said he looked at my paperwork and there was a 4% mortgage on that particular house that was through the war bank or something. Through the banking, this guy had a loan for 4%, and he told me I was getting 7% on my savings, my $10,000. So he advised me to just take over the mortgage.
Do you roughly remember how much the mortgage was? So it was like half the $10,000, or?
Yeah, it was under half. It was still half to be paid yet.
So it was a $10,000 house. You had the $10,000 in cash, but you ended up putting down, I don't know, let's say $6,000, taking over the $4,000 mortgage. So you were able to leave your leave your cash in the investments you had, the savings, the GICs that were earning 7%.
Right.
You're only paying 4% on a mortgage. So someone listening to this today is going to say, boy, those were sure great days then, when you could be earning 7% on a GIC or in an investment at the bank. Obviously, the interest rates are far lower today. That's not even possible, I guess. Do you consider yourself lucky to have been at that time, or do you think you could have done something similar today?
No, to me, that was normal at the time. And that wasn't even the best. The cream of the crop was yet to come, because there was more interest rates than the 7% out there shortly after that.
Well, so let's go through the story then. So you bought your first house for $10,000. You ended up having a mortgage for a portion of that, even though you had the cash, just because the interest rates worked out. And then you decided, hey, I want to build my dream home. So at what point did you start that whole thought process? Tell me what that was like. You ended up finding some land in the country.
Right. I came from a farm and I wanted a farm, but my father advised me against it because he said I was better working in the auto industry.
And so you found a plot of land, though.
I did. I found a piece of land that I could buy for a small amount of money, and I bought 11 acres.
And there was no house on that property?
No, just a bare piece of property.
So you bought the property and then started building the house?
I put feelers out to sell the house I was in and was able to use the money from the house that I sold. I got $30,000 for it. And then the second house that I built cost me $25,700 to build it.
How much did it cost to buy the land?
That was, I think it was $1,000 an acre. Not $9,000 for the 11 acres, yeah.
So $9,000 to buy the land. And how long did it take to actually build the house then? Because you still had the other house that you were living in.
The purchase of the land happened in the late fall, and we were in by that next August. We were in the new house.
So less than a year. And so they started building in the spring then, did they?
Yep.
I'm trying to think through what the messages are for people who are listening to this today. And it sounds to me like you did not buy your dream house the day you started work. It was not right out of high school, I'm buying my dream house. And I assume the reason was pretty simple. You didn't have the money. You didn't have $30,000 or $40,000 or whatever it cost.
No, I didn't. I did. And I wouldn't have made that decision until I had the money to do it.
And that's where you are different than everyone today. Because today, everything's a mortgage. Like, nobody buys a house for cash today. It's just not done. I mean, you can get a mortgage for 95% of the value of the house. What do you think of that? Like, if you were a young person today, let's say you're 30 years old today, and so you've still got another 20, 30 years to work. You've got some money saved up. And let's say today the house you lived in back then, the house you paid $10,000 back then probably cost, what does that cost today? $200,000 for that house? $300,000? I don't know. Let's just make up some numbers here. So let's say you had $50,000 saved up and it's going to cost $300,000 to buy the house. Would you still, I mean, there would be almost no way to save the money today, would there?
No, but again, you got the other period of thought too is that while this was all happening, the interest rates were going up and up and up. At one point, I had money in the bank because at this point, I didn't need any money anymore because I had my house and it was paid for. My second house was paid for. So I put money in GICs and I even got some money as high as 15%.
15%. That was not the mortgage you were paying, that was the interest.
That's on the money that I had left over than saved, and that comes out on my 10%. All you earn is yours to keep. I kept doing that. I kept on doing it even after I bought the house.
And all you earn is yours to keep.
Yeah, 10% of all you earn is yours to keep.
It doesn't really matter what the interest rates are, I guess. That principle still holds true. Tuck the money away, tuck the money away, tuck the money away.
Right.
Is what you do. With interest rates today, they're obviously very low. You know that as well as anyone.
I'm experiencing it now.
You're experiencing it now. What are your thoughts on that? How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel that it's not a very comfortable situation for people to be able to retire.
It's almost as though borrowing is the thing we want everyone to do, not saving.
Right.
Because I'm again thinking, the people are listening to this and they're going, okay, well, that was great in 1954, even though you were only making less than $200 a month, if we did our math right, you were still able to save up $10,000 and buy a house. Today, that would be impossible. I mean, you'd be earning, I don't know, $50,000 working at the same job today, I guess. But if a house is $300,000 and if you can't borrow, if you can't put the money in the bank and earn any interest on it, what's someone supposed to do today? What advice would you give to a young person?
I think you just might as well finance it. It's cheap to buy a house now if you can finance it for 2 or 3% interest.
Because for you, compound interest was something that benefited you.
Every 7 years it doubled.
Because of the rule of 72, but when you were getting the interest rates that you were. Whereas today it would take, well, if you're earning 1% interest, it's going to take 72 years to double. I mean, it's not even possible. So when we look at advice then, your number one piece of advice is to be tucking away 10%?
Yep.
Is there anything more important than that?
Not really. I think it would work today even if you still were insisted on making sure you stick on that pattern.
Even if interest rates are low, as they are today, the other thing you're saying is you've got to prioritize savings over spending. So the 10%, that's the first thing that comes off the top.
Right.
People today don't want to do that. Interest rates are low, so I can borrow, I can get a line of credit, I can buy whatever I want. How did you resist the temptation to buy whatever you wanted?
Well, I bought what I wanted. My house that I'm in now with 11 acres, I have what I wanted, but it's not a very fancy, high-price home on the market today. But it certainly was all I needed. I could have got a bigger house. I could have went out and got a mortgage and bought another house, but I was happy with the one I have.
what about things like spending money on vacations and, a second car, a boat, things like that?
Well, I've spent money on toys, right? I collect antique tractors and restore them.
And you always paid cash for them.
Right. I've never owed anybody any money.
So I want to bring this back from the olden days to today. And I want to make sure I got the numbers right here. So back when you started, wages were just over $1 an hour. So you were making, $45 a week, less than a couple $100 a month. You were able to buy a $10,000 house. Now, obviously you had to save money, but it was actually possible. If you go to the Bank of Canada inflation calculator and put in $1 from 1954, that would be over $9 today. So, money has, gone up in value 9 times, or I guess stated more properly, it's actually devalued that much. That same house that you bought for $10,000 back in the 50s, today would be worth roughly how much? Ballpark number.
$400,000.
How in the world? So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, if I was a 20-year-old person, 30-year-old person today, I'd think, boy, you sure had it great back then. Because even though wages were lower, I mean, even if you use the inflation calculator, that would still equate to $10 an hour in today's money. Obviously, people are making more money than that. But I'm assuming back then taxes were a lot lower.
Oh, definitely.
So out of your paycheck, you got to keep most of it.
Right.
So you were able to save a lot. And then whatever you did save, you were able to put in the bank or put into a GIC and earn lots of interest.
Right.
So it was actually possible to do what you did back then because you got to keep most of your paycheck. You were able to live frugally, and then you were able to put it in a risk-free investment and still earn a decent rate of return. Would that be even possible today?
Well, the difference of today, that the person that wants to go out and buy this $10,000 house that I bought, their expectations have gone way off the map someplace. They think they deserve a $500,000 or $600,000 house. Instead of if they bought a $30,000 house at a small mortgage, they'd be just as well off as I would have been.
So how big was that house, that first house that you bought? In terms of square feet, like was it 1,000 square foot house?
Probably just a little over 1,000.
And I guess that's one of the big differences today.
Yeah.
I mean, no one's buying just a little 1,000 square foot house. We all want a 2,000 square foot or 2,500. So the dream house that you built, which was many decades ago now, I guess, how big is it?
1,300 square feet.
And in fact, that's where we're recording this today, in the basement of that dream house, which is 1,300 square feet, which today I guess people would look at this and they would go, hey, that's a starter home. That's not a dream home.
No, not compared to what they're buying now.
So if you were starting out today, even though interest rates aren't as favorable perhaps as what they would be, you would still be able to do what you were able to do because you'd be more frugal. Is that really what it comes down to?
Right. I was, in my mind, said don't spend what you don't have to spend. Make sure that when you buy something, there's something else left after you're finished buying. And don't forget, too, there's more things today, more toys that people are being tempted to buy. Back when I bought my last house, we weren't looking for a whole bunch of dream. We were just looking for a house that was reliable and a nice place to live in.
So give me some examples of the toys we have today that you didn't have to worry about in the 50s and 60s.
Well, 3 cars, 4 cars in one family, and I had one.
And you were able to get a deal on cars. And even then, you still had one.
Right, we had 1 car.
So did everybody else who started at Chrysler's when you did retire in 30 years? Or did a lot of them stay longer?
A lot of them stayed longer. I was the first one on a management job on salary to take advantage of the 30 years and out.
And so what did the other people there say? What did your boss say when you said, hey, I'm leaving after 30 years?
Well, he told me I was making a mistake. He realized I had enough money to live on it, but he told me inflation rate was going to kill me and I'd be in trouble by the time I was 50 years old. But if he would have told me interest rates would have dropped down to 1 or 2% that you're getting on GICs now, I might have taken his advice, but I wasn't worried about inflation because I knew I had enough stashed away to cover inflation. but I didn't have enough stashed away to cover the fact that you can only get 1 or 1.5% interest on a GIC.
So having to do it again, maybe you would have worked a bit longer. You might have had to, I guess. But you really have not much in the way of a pension. I mean, it's really your savings that have done it as opposed to some kind of pension because you left so early.
Right. Leaving early, my pension is very, very small.
So it's entirely the savings that are doing it. Now, let's talk about investments. So tell me about your career in the stock market. I assume you invested lots of money in the stock market. You did a lot of day trading. Tell me about the stock market.
Well, that didn't happen. I felt on this little plan that I made with somebody else, it was the same theory as me, that we would do this savings 10%. We did buy stocks. I bought a couple or 3 shares of different stocks, but it didn't go so good. It kind of fell apart on me. In fact, I've still got the paperwork yet today, and it's still sitting there, but I can't even find out how much it's worth. So I abandoned that idea and gave up the fact that I was going to rely on the stock market because I like to sleep at night.
You like to sleep at night. So the investments you made in the stock market, you basically went bust on, didn't
they're bust, right?
They went bust. So you decided pretty quickly that wasn't the way to go for you.
That changed my theory, yeah.
And so all of your investments were in what?
GICs or investing in my own property.
Investing in your own property. So you have not had a mortgage for decades and decades and decades then.
Right.
Is it prudent then for, young people today to have as low a mortgage as possible then, or with interest rates as low as they are, or would you be doing things differently?
Well, I would certainly jump on the bandwagon, if I had to borrow money, I wouldn't mind borrowing money at 3% or 2%, but I'd not necessarily would I do it because it's too late for me now to make a change now.
Do you think you'd be doing anything differently stock market-wise if you had started 20 years later? Or would you have still had the same?
I still would have. It's embedded in my brain.
And the whole not being able to sleep is a big thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you're willing to accept a lesser return,
right?
If you can, as you say, sleep at night.
I know I can keep it. Whatever return I got, whatever I've got saved, put away, it's still there.
And so really what it comes down to then is frugality. That's the bottom line on it.
Yes.
So what advice then, and our sound man today is, my son, your grandson, he's working the board here for us today. He's 18 years old, the exact same age you were when you started at Chrysler's. What advice would you give to your 18-year-old self or to your grandson who's 18 years old today? The world's a different place, obviously. Interest rates are different. Things are a bit different. But what advice would you give in today's world?
I don't think I could give many advice because I don't think it would work. What I did wouldn't work today.
Because of the interest rates?
Because of the interest rate that I'm not getting to carry on. But
as I look at what you've said... So I'm trying to kind of distill your theory for this, book you're going to write. And the book would say, number one, pay yourself first. 10% of everything is yours, as you put it, right? So that advice still works today.
Yes, it does, except that you don't get much return on it.
But 10% of everything you make, you tuck away. And you're right, you don't earn as much on it as you could have. But, perhaps, and I guess not perhaps, that's why today young people, middle-aged people are more likely to be putting their money into things like mutual funds and whatnot. Obviously, there's higher risk to that. But I guess the risk is spread out a bit by putting it in mutual funds, not individual stocks, that kind of thing. The second thing, though, was the way you prioritized your spending over savings. You didn't take 10 vacations a year, you didn't have 4 cars, and you didn't buy a big house. All those things are still applicable today.
Yeah, right. You could do that.
If you were starting out today, if you did those things, put aside 10% and, didn't spend extravagantly, would you still have your savings in GICs, or do you think you would do something riskier?
No, I think that, first of all, I would say 10% put away isn't enough. You'd have to put away 20% now.
Just because you don't get the interest.
To compensate for it. I would, if I was doing it again, that's what I would do. I would save 20%. In fact, probably I save more than the 10% anyway, because money, it's easier to grow money once it starts to pile up.
Yeah, the first dollar is the hardest one, and then once you start building from there. So how do you lower expectations? Is that a proper way of putting it? How do you be comfortable with an 1,100 square foot house instead of a 3,000 square foot house? Because that's the thing today. You know, all my friends have a 3,000 square foot house. All of my friends have 2 cars or 3 cars. All of my friends have a boat or, you know, an ATV or something. How can you not have those things?
Well, I think because I don't want to be in a class that I don't belong in. My house is what in value is what my life has been valued at. That's my money's worth. My house now probably is worth $400,000, mainly because it has 11 acres with it. But I put the value on that. That somebody else might think they would rather have $100,000, but I'm not looking for a fancy house. I'm looking for a good house that's done the job for us.
Do you worry about what everyone else thinks?
No. I think about it, but I don't. It can't change me. Nothing's going to change.
If, you know, the 5 guys you started with at Chrysler's all had a big house and you had a reasonable house, would that gnaw at you or not so much?
No, it wouldn't, not a bit.
Really, that's the secret to your success then?
Yeah, right. I could have stayed a little longer and spent a lot more, and I would be in a different situation I'm in now.
And really, it doesn't matter what the interest rates are. Sure, it matters, but ultimately, if you say, you know what, I'm happy with this house, this car, this pair of shoes, then that solves most of your problems.
Yes.
Because in my experience, that's what gets people into trouble. Have you ever carried a balance on a credit card?
No. I pay for it when the bill comes.
So if you can't afford it, you don't buy it.
Right.
It's pretty much that simple. So
I would not finance anything.
So is there any other advice you can give anyone under the age of 80, which I guess is young people, from your perspective? Any other advice you would give them to be able to keep their mindset such that, no, I'm happy with what I've got?
I'm sure there's still people like me out there, and I would hope that the younger generation something might happen in the next few years to kind of bring it more in balance.
And that's really what it comes down to. You got to have that balance.
Yeah.
So, well, that's good. I think those are that's a good summary of how the world, in many respects, was a lot different, whatever that was, 50 years ago. But the basic principles are still the same. Pay yourself first and wait till you've got the cash before you spend it. Keep your borrowing down, and ultimately, you know, maybe you can't retire at 48, but you know, maybe you can retire at 58 or something today. So excellent. Well, thanks very much for being here.
Well, thank you.
That was my conversation with Bob Lassaline, my father-in-law. He started work on the line at Chrysler, or as they say in Windsor, Chryslers with an S on the end, at age 18, put in his 30 years, and retired at the age of 48. His pension was small, so most of his retirement income comes from his savings. So what lessons can we learn from Bob? Well, there's no doubt that some things are different today than back when he retired. Interest rates are lower, so it's virtually impossible to invest enough money in a savings account or a GIC and still generate enough income to live on in retirement. Taxes are higher, so we don't get to keep as much of our paycheck as we used to. It's not easy to get a great paying job right out of high school. Today, to get a good paying job, it's likely that you'll need a college or university education, and that means that you're starting work later in life and perhaps with a lot of student debt. Those were problems that Bob didn't have to worry about. It's also true that Bob did retire from his job at age 48, but he also took a victory lap after his formal retirement. Back on show number 108, my guests were Jonathan Chevreau and Mike Drack, who wrote the book Victory Lap Retirement, where they explain that after you retire, you can still do things to have fun and earn money. Of course, 30 years ago, the concept of a victory lap retirement didn't exist, but that's exactly what Bob did. In the year or two after he retired, he worked on contract at another company, helping them set up a new plant. It was work, but it was also on his terms. For many years after retirement, he also used one of his tractors to cut lawns at a few businesses. He enjoyed it, so he didn't think of it as work, but it did generate some income. Some things are different, but what are the 5 tips we can learn from a guy who retired at age 48? Well, tip number 1, no debt. Bob did have a mortgage on his house at the start, but he paid it off as quickly as he could, and he never carried a balance on a credit card. Not having interest payments makes it a lot easier to retire early, and certainly that's something we've discussed many times here on Debt Free in 30. Tip number 2, and this is probably the most important tip, pay yourself first. Or as Bob puts it, 10% of all you earn is yours to keep. That leads into tip number 3, which is to prioritize savings over spending. If you pay yourself first and make a commitment to saving money before you spend, you can save money. Tip number 4 is that there is a momentum to savings. As Bob says, it's easier to grow money once it starts to pile up. The first dollar is the hardest to save, but once you establish the savings habit, it becomes easier. And the final tip, tip number 5, is don't worry about what everyone else has or thinks. Bob lives, with his wife, my mother-in-law, in a house that's small by today's standards, but they're happy with it, and they don't worry if someone else has a bigger house, or more cars, or goes on more vacations. He's happy with what he's got, so he's not tempted to try to buy more than he needs. That's great advice, and that's how he retired at age 48. That's our show for today. Full show notes, including a transcript of today's show, are available at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.